Samuel Beckett is the third of the three great masters who made the literary world look to Ireland for its models. In some ways, he is the most unusual, for unlike W.B. Yeats and James Joyce, he has declined to celebrate or affirm anything in human life. He will admit to only four certainties: that he has been born, is living, will die, and for reasons unknown and unknowable, cannot keep silence. The Beckett hero is usually well on in years. As his passions and appetites flag, he tells himself and others inconclusive stories, asks useless questions, performs useless gestures. Out of an embarrassment of distress, a strange world of farce and tragedy is created. Beckett's characters manage somehow to be funny, even as their eyes grow wet with tears. Samuel Beckett was born on Good Friday, April the 13th, 1906. The Beckett family lived in the well-heeled suburb of Foxrock, at the foot of the Dublin Mountains, close to the Leopardstown racecourse. Beckett's father, a quantity surveyor, built his large and impressive house. William Beckett was good at sports, and so was his son Samuel. They loved to watch, as well as to participate in them. Between father and son, there grew up an easy affection. Beckett's mother was more complicated. A lover of animals, she kept a donkey and several dogs in the family grounds of Cooldrina. She was both affectionate and severe to her younger son, and his struggles to connect with her would later occasionally obtrude into his writings. Samuel Barclay Beckett was the second son, born at home not long after the family had moved into Cooldrina. His elder brother Frank Edward had been born 4 years earlier in 1902. May Beckett was a devout Protestant. Every Sunday she walked with her sons to the Church of Tullow, where the family had a pew. William Beckett encouraged his sons to swim, to play rugby, cricket and tennis, to tackle the most demanding mountain walks, and to throw themselves without fear into all athletic contests. Both boys were sent to Portora Royal School in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland, where half a century before they had been preceded by another famous pupil, Oscar Wilde. Young Samuel gave much of his attention to sport. Notwithstanding his slender build, he played scrum half at rugby. A classmate described him as half blind but brave as a lion about the scrum. He was less notable in his studies, even French, at which he would later show an unexampled proficiency. But he could not help writing his English essays well. When, like many Portora boys, Beckett went on to Trinity College Dublin, his literary enthusiasms made scholastic excellence unavoidable. He studied Italian with Walter Starkey and French with Thomas Rudmose Brown, becoming a devotee of Dante with the one and of Baudelaire with the other. He played the piano, cultivating a lasting interest in music, Schubert being among his favorites. At Trinity, Beckett won a gold medal for scholarship and his colours on the university cricket team. After graduation, he knew that quantity surveying was not for him. He tried school teaching, but soon gave it up. He could not bear to teach others what he did not know himself. He chose instead to become a poet. It was, he said, the last ditch for an unemployable man. From childhood, Beckett accompanied his father on 10 or 20-mile walks across the hills overlooking Fox Rock. Here they would wander through mountain and moorland until the fall of night. Much of Beckett's early work was in verse. Doubtless he had his experiences of youthful love, and he had something of the romantic's feeling for nature. But his early motivation to write came not from these, but from pain. Besides poems, Beckett wrote stories, bizarre stories, in which a hero, someone like Beckett himself, tries ineffectually to come to terms with the social world. When they were published in 1934 under the astonishing title More Pricks Than Kicks, the book was banned in Ireland. To his consternation, Beckett found that he now had a number, 465, on the censorship lists. He was dismayed and embittered to find himself suffering under so parochial an authority. In June 1933, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. As would happen several times later in his life, disaster spurred him on. More than half of his early published verse dates from the aftermath of his father's death. As a young man, Beckett traveled in France and Germany. He then lived for a time in London, but eventually he returned to Dublin. Out of his years of wandering grew a first novel, which he entitled after the most common of Irish names, Murphy. The first of those Beckett characters who appear to live on the edge of non-being. He is trying to extricate himself from this world and has got pretty far. We meet him first as he rocks himself in his armchair. Beckett spent some time writing in the attic of the Quantity Surveyor's office at 6 Clare Street. This may well be the haven to which Murphy retreats from the world he despises. Murphy's attempts to seek unreality are abortive. For having forgotten an unlit gas jet, he expires. His will specifies the disposition of his body in a way that crystallizes his contempt for local institutions.
With regard to the disposal of these my body, mind, and soul, I desire that they be burnt and placed in a paper bag and brought to the Abbey Theatre, Lower Abbey Street, Dublin, and without pause into what the great and good Lord Chesterfield calls the necessary house, where their happiest hours have been spent, on the right as one goes down into the pit, and I desire that the chain be there pulled upon them, if possible, during the performance of a piece, the whole to be executed without ceremony or show of grief.
But the instructions are forgotten. The bearer of the ashes throws them at someone in a pub, and they disperse all over the floor. So even Murphy's effort to use his death for purposes of mockery miscarries.
By closing time, the body, mind, and soul of Murphy were freely distributed over the floor of the saloon, and before another dayspring grained the earth, had been swept away with the sand, the beer, the butts, the glass, the matches, the spits, the vomit.
In his writings, the voice he hears has an Irish inflection. Many of Beckett's characters have unmistakably Irish names. Beckett knew, however, that he would have to find his audience and his way of life outside Ireland. Yet Irish he remained, in his sensory history, in his family ties. Asked later if he was English, Beckett replied simply, au contraire. Beckett's life was altered in 1928, when his old professor at Trinity, Rudmose Brown, recommended him as lecturer for 2 years at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. The plan, which of course miscarried, was for him to write a thesis as well as teach, and eventually return to a position as lecturer at Trinity. For Beckett, going to Paris was like coming home. Paris received its bohemian foreigners benignly and provided them with a literary and artistic scene unrivaled in its ferment. In his early period in Paris, Beckett was captivated by the disconnected imagery of the surrealists. He translated poems by Breton, Eluard, and Crevel. He neglected his thesis to study Descartes. On hearing that Nancy Cunard, a wealthy English woman living in the Rue Guénégaud, was offering a prize of 1,000 francs for the best work on a theme of time, Beckett composed a satirical picture of the life of Descartes and submitted it under the title Horoscope. He won the prize, and the poem was published. From poetry, Beckett turned to write 2 important essays. The first insisted that in Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, form and content were indivisible. The second praised Proust for refusing to yield to what Beckett considered to be the distortions of intelligibility, of cause and effect, of reason. Both essays prepared the way for his own practice. His experience of bereavement in Dublin helped him to compose a small volume of verse. By the time he published Echo's Bones in 1935, he was almost 30, yet unrecognized as a writer except among a few friends and colleagues. In 1938, this obscure talent was almost lost. On the 11th of January, the Irish Times carried a headline telling how an Irish poet had been stabbed on the previous day in Paris. As Beckett was walking around the corner of the Villa Cour de Veille, a local pimp approached and asked him for money. On Beckett's refusal, the man stabbed him in the chest. Fortunately, the knife had missed the vital organs, and Beckett recovered in hospital. While he was there, he received a visit from a woman whom he had previously met. Her name was Suzanne de Chevaux-Duménil. The occasion proved to be a momentous one. He would share her life and later marry her. Beckett happily formed a friendship with another Irish lecturer at the École Normale, Thomas McGreevy, later to be director of the National Gallery of Ireland. Though McGreevy was devout and Beckett anything but, the 2 men greatly enjoyed each other's company. Through McGreevy, Beckett was introduced to James Joyce, and Joyce, though chary of compliments, thought that Beckett had talent. They saw each other often during the decade that followed. Their conversations consisted often of silences directed towards each other. Both suffused with sadness, Beckett mostly for the world, Joyce mostly for himself. Their literary paths slowly diverged, as it became clear that Finnegan's Wake sought to put everything in, while Beckett's work sought to take everything out. A favorite rendezvous was the Pont de Grenelle, from which they would walk together along the Isle of Swans. Beckett made a trip back to Ireland to see his family now living in Greystones. On Sunday, the 3rd of September 1939, he and his brother Frank walked over to the Grand Hotel to listen to the radio. Like the rest of the world, they were shocked to hear Neville Chamberlain grimly announce on the BBC,
"I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany."
Beckett had to decide whether to stay in neutral Ireland or return to beleaguered France. He preferred France at war to Ireland in peace. In a way, this decision might be said to have brought his youth to an end. Within a year, Paris was occupied by the German army. Beckett was horrified at the murders of his Jewish friends by the Nazis. He said he could not stand with his arms folded, and instead joined the resistance. For some months, he worked as a microphotographer and translator. But in August 1942, the leader of his cell was captured and revealed the names of his associates. Beckett's wife went to warn friends, only to find that the Gestapo were already arresting them. Thinking fast, she said she had come for her cat. They were skeptical and followed her to her apartment. There they saw Beckett's books, many of them in German, including a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. Deceived, or half deceived, they allowed her to go. Suzanne joined Beckett, who was in hiding, and together they hiked southwards towards unoccupied France. They traveled by night for 3 weeks, and finally managed to crawl over the line near Vichy. On they walked towards relatives of Suzanne near Avignon. For the 3 remaining years of the war, they hid out in the incongruously charming village of Roussillon, with barely enough to eat and in considerable fear. Here they waited for war to end. Beckett continued his resistance activities. He refuses to discuss them, dismissing the matter as Boy Scout stuff. But General de Gaulle put a different value upon them when, after the war, he conferred the Croix de Guerre on Beckett. When the war was at last over, Beckett could again visit his mother, now living at a new place, Fox Rock. She was suffering from Parkinson's disease, which in 1950 would cause her death. He renewed his relationship with his brother Frank, who had taken over the family business. Beckett remained with his mother for 6 weeks, caring for her and reading to her, with feelings of mounting distress. It was as if the general misfortunes of wartime had found a local focus in her difficult breathing. This sight, and all that he had lived through in France, now converged in Beckett's mind. Walking along the rock-bordered Dunleary Pier, something happened to him for which he would later never find a word, but he said, a little apologetically, that it was a revelation. The course of his literary life suddenly opened before him. Where others had sought enrichment, he would seek impoverishment. It was like resolving to go naked. He would give a voice to the enfeebled, the debilitated, the moribund, all those poor creatures who had been beneath or apart from the notice of most writers before him. Of course, he had sensed their importance earlier and had been feeling his way towards them. But now he experienced a full realization. When he would write of this magical moment long afterwards, he could do it only through irony. The banana-eating Crap in Crap's last tape plays back a bit of the identical experience and hastily switches it off to listen to a quite different one. Beckett did not exempt himself from satire. The revelation, nevertheless, enabled him to begin work on what we now know as his famous trilogy, Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. Although he began the work at New Place Fox Rock, it was in Paris, in his apartment at Rue de Favourite, he would write for the next 6 years from 1946 to 1952. Not ever before or after would he experience so impassioned a creative period. As if to signalize the new epoch in his life, he began to write in French. The discovery of a new subject warranted a new language. Though he found the change difficult, it gave him a sense of exaltation, even as he described creatures at their last gasp or near it. The trilogy is a kind of summa of Beckett's point of view. Here, the everyday world is thoroughly discredited. Beckett's wife hawked the manuscript from publisher to publisher. Unfortunately, no one wanted to publish this extraordinary creation. Her husband, accustomed to obscurity, showed no surprise or resentment. But one day, in November 1951, Jérôme Landon, whose publishing house was Les Éditions de Minuit, summoned Suzanne to his office. Landon had the courage and confidence to see, for all the unsavouriness of Becket's subject, that here was a great talent. He has published Becket ever since. The trilogy had taken Becket into a more and more profound darkness. He was not bogged down, he said, he was fogged down. He needed a respite, and between the second and third books he undertook an enterprise of a quite different kind. On a road going nowhere, he said, he looked for a measurable, habitable place in the light. He found it on the stage. The name of his play was Waiting for Godot. No one could have anticipated the impact of this work. Becket had no dramatic experience when he wrote Waiting for Godot. He wrote the play in a school notebook. Among his manuscripts, he has held on to this one. The play came to him in a rush. It was written in less than 4 months and with scarcely any corrections. He began it on the 9th of October 1948, finished it 4 months later on the 29th of January 1949. It was first produced at the Théâtre de Babylone in Paris on January the 6th, 1952, and ran for more than 300 performances. Waiting for Godot was the turning point for Samuel Beckett. It was the point at which his public found him, and he found his public. His face became almost as famous as his characteristic images: tramps, boots, hats, dustbins, trees. A Beckett landscape became as recognizable as a Dickensian scene. With this play, Beckett produced an upheaval in modern drama. Society plays and problem plays were made equally out of date. There was now a strange new school of playwriting in which a heavy emptiness weighed on the characters, and yet a weird humour pervaded them as well. Though Beckett helped in the production of his plays, he sought and kept his privacy. Asked what he meant, he replied that he meant what he said. He never attended a first night, and no interviews or press conferences were granted. In 1956, Beckett wrote to a friend, "Success and failure on the public level never mattered much to me. In fact, I feel much more at home with the latter, having breathed deep of its vivifying air all my writing life, up to the last 2 years." For a man who has never wanted for friends, Beckett has chosen as his subjects people in the last ditch, usually alone or dubiously companioned. Finished. It's finished. Nearly finished. It must be nearly finished. Says Clough at the start of Endgame, Beckett's second published play. It contains 4 characters. 2 of them, Nag and Nell, being legless, are kept upright by the dustbins in which they live. The central character, Ham, is a hopeless invalid, crippled and blind, badly attended by a badly treated servant, Clough. Disaster has struck the world outside, and apart from these 4 characters confined to one room, there is no other apparent existence. The material sounds hardly auspicious for a play or anything else, yet misery, pushed to such an extreme, becomes almost funny. There is a certain grim pleasure in stating the worst perfectly. In 1969, Samuel Beckett was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. In its citation, the Swedish Academy said that Mr. Beckett was being honoured for his writing, which, in new forms for the novel and drama, acquires its elevation from the destitution of modern man. Beckett has not been willing to say whether this is true or not. My work, he has said, is a matter of fundamental sounds, no joke intended, made as fully as possible, and I accept responsibility for nothing else. For a man who has spent his life celebrating in literature the futility of existence and the joyous hope for the peace of death, his writing shows surprisingly little sign of running down. Beckett's work goes on undiminished, with language and humour pitted against grief and silence.
I love the word. Words have been my only loves, not many.
In his later works, Beckett seems to strive towards a narrower and narrower compass, a plainer diction, a bigger role for silence. Limbless, eyeless, or whatever elseless, his characters have feelings and wonderful words to express them. Ludicrous and pathetic, they are proof that the residue of the human is still human.